Hey guys, today I want to talk about a very interesting book called Redating Ancient Greece by Sylvain Tristan. I'm basically going to be summarizing this book, and if you find this information interesting, or if you think it's completely ludicrous, I definitely recommend this book. It's a very good book, and very interesting either way. Now the main concept here is dealing with shifted chronology, and particularly here there is a claim that many of the events said to have taken place in the ancient world in ancient Greece may have happened 1800 years in the future. So it's a proposed 1800-year shift. Now the standard chronology is known as the Scaligerian chronology. This is the chronology that you're going to be getting in your McGraw-Hill textbook at school. This is the chronology that's going to be featured in any mainstream documentary or that any mainstream professor or intellectual will reference. But many people have had a problem with this timeline. Most recently, a man named Anatoly Fomenko has produced many books on this subject, and much of this book derives from that. But Sir Isaac Newton also had a problem with the standard chronology, and a book was published a year after he died that he had been writing for many years about his problems with the standard chronology. One of the main points here in both Newton and Fomenko, and here with Sylvain Tristan, is that there appears to be many phantom events and phantom people. And you can visualize this with these types of graphs. Say you were to plot a year with a significant amount of historical events, and obviously you could look at those events and see if they resemble events at different points in history, but you can plot year by year what happens, how many events, what types of events, and you can see repeating patterns many centuries in the future. So on the left, we have two periods of time that appear to line up in the types of events or the amount of events that happened at particular periods and with reference to other decades and centuries around it. So this is how we can have whole phantom periods, as is being claimed in this book, that ancient Greece itself is comprised of events that happened many centuries later. And so it would have a graph like the one on the left. Whereas the one on the right, you could see that the events, when they're graphed, they just don't line up. They don't look like they're dependent on each other. So on the left, this is called a dependent chronicle. Two periods of time that seem to match up so well that they're called dependent chronicles. And on the right, we see non-dependent chronicles. When plotted out, they bear no resemblance to earlier periods of time. And these graphs also represent the same thing, mirrored or phantom things and people in different places or periods of time. So there are three main reasons given for this distortion, this timeline distortion, and what they call phantom events or phantom characters, basically characters that repeat themselves hundreds or thousands of years later in our standard chronology. So these three reasons to explain these phantom events are the Rashomon effect, the language factor, and the Thanksgiving effect. And there is also the possibility of forgeries or deliberate attempts to rewrite history, basically, although that is not the focus of this book. The Rashomon effect is a well-known scholarly concept which owes its name to the 1950 Japanese film Rashomon. In the film, a murder is described by four different witnesses: a bandit, the victim's wife, a samurai, and a woodcutter, each of whom gives a very different interpretation of the same event. The four versions are mutually contradictory because each character has their own self-serving interests to defend, their own perception and subjectivity, their own memory of the event, their own way of reporting, and their own goals to achieve. Applied to history, the Rashomon effect can have far-reaching consequences, as one particular event can be told very differently by different sources. The way a battle is described, for instance, will heavily depend on the witnesses and the people who will recount the story later, as different individuals will have different axes to grind and will not select the same facts nor interpret them the same way. The same battle will be depicted 1,000 times differently by 1,000 direct witnesses, as each witness will, deliberately or not, distort the event their own way from the very start, and the distortions are bound to become even greater when told by people who have not attended the event themselves, as of course many chroniclers of history were not there. And of course, people tend to depict their own history in a more favorable light, emphasizing the victories and playing down the defeats, even going as far as to call a victory what was actually a defeat. Next, the language factor is quite simple. People speak and write in different languages with very different sound systems, meaning they will transcribe one particular name, be it a person, a people, or a geographical place, in ways that are not always immediately recognizable by others. What's more, they will often give different names or nicknames to people or geographical places that will greatly differ from those given by other people speaking other languages and having a different culture, meaning that the people or places described will end up having utterly different names that may often be mutually unrecognizable. For example, Germans call themselves Deutsch, but the English call them Germans. The French call them Allemand. The Finnish call them Saksa, or Saxons, and the Russians call them, a word I probably can't pronounce, Niemcy. All these terms hail from different roots. Even when the same root is used, the word is not always immediately recognizable. For instance, the Italians call the Germans the Tedeschi, which is cognate to Deutsch, but because Italians have added a prefix to the root and also because of the distortion due to the passing of time, the two terms have become quite distinct from each other. And of course, this phenomenon is probably even amplified in the way that people name other tribes or less known people, and they could have given those people any name. Next, we have what is known as the Thanksgiving effect. This is, with the passing of time, errors and exaggerations multiply, but these are repeated by the next generation before undergoing further distortion, which gradually creates a mythologized version of events. Errors and distortions tend to increase and accumulate with geographical distance and/or time, something that was especially true before the invention of print, which occurred only in the mid-15th century. Even after the invention of the printing press, the memory of one particular event can rapidly fade and alter so as to considerably distort. This is what is called the Thanksgiving effect, because the modern story of Thanksgiving in America has considerably evolved from what it truly was at the start. So the deeper we go back into the past, the more likely it is that one particular story has become embellished, and the greater the chance that the story is a complete myth, or at least a very different story from what it was originally. And the first Thanksgiving is indeed a good example to illustrate this point. And the myth basically in America goes as such. In 1620, a group of about 100 people known as the Pilgrim Fathers fled the religious persecution in England and sailed to the New World in a ship named the Mayflower. The Pilgrim Fathers are remembered as the first Europeans settling in Massachusetts. There they stepped ashore on the rock they decided to name Plymouth because they originally came from Plymouth, England. These people were dressed in black and white and wore buckled hats. They made friends with the local Native Americans, and in order to thank the Native Americans for what they had taught them, in November of 1621, the Pilgrims organized a 3-day harvest feast, during which they invited a few natives to sit around their table. They ate turkey and pumpkin pie. This event is generally considered as the first Thanksgiving, a late November tradition which has endured every year in America since. But how true is this brief account? Since both this event and the 4 centuries that followed it have been extensively studied by modern scholars, it is now possible to compare the conventional story to what most probably truly happened. First of all, the Mayflower did not land in Plymouth. The settlers first landed at the extreme tip of Cape Cod, in what is today known as Provincetown. The famed symbolic Plymouth Rock that is still revered today? Interestingly, the surviving documents of the time say nothing about a Plymouth Rock. The first mention of it is found in the town records of 1715, nearly a century after the event. At the time, of course, all the pilgrims had long died. In 1741, or 121 years after the event, a 94-year-old man claimed that the rock had been pointed out to him as the original landing spot by some of the pilgrims themselves when he was young, but this has proved to be a long after-the-fact, second-hand assertion. For all we know, he may even have made up the whole story. In addition, it seems quite unlikely for a boat to have landed along a slippery boulder in early winter, as this would have been quite impractical. The story is then likely to be mythical. There is also the issue of the pilgrim's very name. At the time, the so-called pilgrims referred to themselves as saints and strangers. For about a century and a half, the Plymouth colonists were only vaguely remembered. The term Pilgrim Fathers was only rarely used before the 1790s. In 1820, the orator Daniel Webster used that term, popularizing it further. But it was only in the 1870s that the term became really common, 2 centuries and a half after the colonists' arrival. Incidentally, only about a half of the Mayflower passengers can truly be referred to as pilgrims, i.e. people looking for religious freedom, as the other half, the strangers, were immigrants merely looking for new opportunity and land in the New World. It would also be wrong to say that the Pilgrim Fathers were the first immigrants in Massachusetts, as by 1620 European sailors had already been sailing along the coast repeatedly, mainly looking for cod. The Pilgrims' black coats also appear to be a myth. Black fabric was extremely expensive at the time, and the Pilgrim suits were most probably brown, earth tone, orange, and green. This vision of pilgrims dressed in dark clothes was created much later, probably by 19th century artists rendering the scene. As for the buckles, they're mythical too. They became fashionable in the 18th century only, and they started to appear on pilgrims only in 19th century representations by Victorian artists who wished to make them look more ancient. What about the first Thanksgiving? First of all, the real harvest feast probably didn't take place in late November. It probably occurred between early September and early November of 1621. According to a letter written by the pilgrim Edward Winslow, discovered in 1841 only, or 220 years after the event, the one and only eyewitness account of the event, the feast occurred on October 16th, and the settlers did not eat turkey but land fowl. Most likely, the settlers also fed on seafood, such as eel, as well as fox and venison, as well as pumpkin, but certainly no pumpkin pie. It was the New Englander who discovered the letter in 1841 who decided that the harvest feast ought to be called the first Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims would certainly not call that feast Thanksgiving, such a name being reserved to a religious celebration. The notion that the colonists invited a few Native Americans to join them around their table also proves to be a myth, as the natives outnumbered the settlers. There were 90 natives and only 40 settlers. Whom fed whom then? Again, the traditional vision has to be partly reversed. It was the Native Americans who hunted the venison, not the settlers. What's more, Thanksgiving has certainly not been continuously celebrated since 1620. It was only in 1827 that the writer Sarah Josepha Hale launched a national campaign to bring about a Thanksgiving holiday. She wrote to President Lincoln about creating a Thanksgiving Day, and it was only much later in 1863 that Thanksgiving became a national holiday in the United States, as well as a founding symbol. Back in 1621, the Pilgrims and Native Americans were certainly not on friendly terms. Up to 2/3 of the local natives had been killed by either slave owners or diseases brought by the Europeans in previous years. And the native named Squanto in this myth is said to have learned English from local fishermen, but he had actually been kidnapped as a boy to become a slave and learned English during the many years he spent in Spain and England. He learned English precisely because he wanted to escape from slavery. Only 4 centuries have elapsed since this actual event, and yet the gap between the modern Thanksgiving story and the core reality buried underneath layers of myth is utterly dumbfounding. And all of this happened in the era of the printed word. Whether or not ancient Greece occurred 2 millennia before Gutenberg or a few centuries only before him, the Thanksgiving story teaches us one thing. If so many myths have grown around an event that occurred only 400 years ago, how likely are we to have an accurate version of events that are even more ancient, and which predate the invention of print? And let us not forget the possibility that some events said to be historical can actually be complete forgeries, whatever the motivations are behind it. These fake historical facts, when mixed with true events, can further distort the sequence of events in our chronicle. Fomenko also points out that ancient dynasties used in one particular chronicle are not necessarily dynasties belonging to the people who claim they belong to them. They might be in fact the distorted list of kings and queens of another civilization which has been, deliberately or mistakenly, included in their own list so as to make their own history look more ancient than it truly is, as an older culture is generally implicitly regarded as a superior culture in a world of competing civilizations. Many authors claim that our history has been artificially extended by the forgery of ancient manuscripts made during the Renaissance. This, of course, compounds the problems caused by the Rashomon effect, the language factor, and the Thanksgiving effect. Let us briefly give a couple examples. A French Jesuit who was contemporary to Newton claimed that most ancient classics of Greece and Rome are spurious, and all of the ancient writings of the Church are forgeries of the 14th century or later. The style of Latin used, in his estimation, can't be older than the 14th century. Edwin Johnson, an English historian who lived in the second half of the 19th century, claimed that the Dark Ages between the years 700 and 1400 AD had never existed, and that it is an invention of Christian writers, chiefly the Benedictines of the 16th century. Interestingly, the Swiss philologist Robert Baldorf in the early 20th century arrived at the same conclusions while using different methods. According to him, most ancient Greek authors such as Homer, Sophocles, and Aristotle are forgeries made by a restricted group of Italian humanists in the 14th and 15th centuries. His conclusions are drawn from the fact that the Bible or Homer's Iliad have too many stylistic similarities with late medieval romances for them to be really ancient, and that ancient Roman authors Horace and Ovid have such similar writing style that they were probably created by a unique author living in a much more recent period. Although forgeries probably played an important role in consolidating the currently accepted chronology we use today, it is far from being the only factor in play, and it is not the purpose of this book to discuss them. But there is a case that is discussed in this book, namely the case of Plato's writings. One of the things to take into consideration is the fact that the Greek language has really not changed very much. In fact, a modern Greek person should really have no problem understanding the New Testament, for example, written in ancient Greek. This itself is anomalous. If this language was spoken in the ancient world, we would have expected it to have changed very much over the ensuing centuries and millennia. But the Greek language seems to have changed less than any modern language, or any other ancient languages that we know of. The Greek language is said to be over 2,500 years old, Yet in the last 2,000 years, Vulgar Latin has evolved into the many Romance languages such as Italian, Venetian, Sicilian, Spanish, Catalan, Portuguese, French, Romanian, and many others. At the same time, the original Latin disappeared. In the case of Latin, things look pretty clear. In the course of the last 2,000 years, one mother language has given birth to several daughter languages, while itself vanishing from existence in everyday speech. But what about Greek? Greek has evolved too. The first odd thing about Greek, though, is that it hasn't branched out into new daughter languages. Linguists distinguish different types of Greek depending on the period and the area concerned, yet these languages are generally all called Greek. Indeed, Greek is considered to be among the world's oldest living languages. Yet modern Greek is still close enough to what it was in ancient times so as to make it acceptable for all forms of Greek to be dubbed Greek. There are fewer differences between modern Greek and the Greek of Homer, who was supposed to have lived somewhere between 2600 and 2800 years ago, than there are between today's English and 12th century English, spoken only 800 or 900 years ago. In other words, English has evolved more in 800 years than Greek has in 26 to 2800 years. What we see implies that Greek evolves at the very least 3 times more slowly than English, which makes Greek particularly unusual. We can see how quickly language evolves just by going back to Shakespeare's plays, which are slightly over 400 years old, and are spoken in a tongue that nobody would use today, and hardly anyone can even understand. The case of Arabic is also quite enlightening. The earliest inscriptions in Arabic are thought to date back around the 6th century AD, roughly 1500 years ago. Although Arabic-speaking people generally call their language Arabic, it is well known that the present-day dialects greatly differ from one country or region to the other, and that mutual comprehension is often impossible or difficult. All of these dialects, which are often de facto separate languages, significantly differ from the original 6th century Arabic which is used in the Quran. Indeed, it is estimated that the linguistic difference between different dialects of spoken Arabic is about the same as the one observed in the Romance languages, even though the original language is thought to be closer to us than Latin. If Anatoly Fomenko is wrong, we have to accept that Greek, unlike most languages on Earth, if not all, has so slow an evolution rate that it has remained more or less constant over more than 2,500 years. So if Orthodox history is right, we have to admit that Greek is an exception, linguistically. But with the revised chronology, Homer could have existed not 28 to 2600 years from us, but rather 1000 to 800 years ago. And if Homer lived around the year 1200 AD, it suddenly becomes much less surprising that Homer's Greek is not that different from the Greek spoken in the streets of Athens today. Even further, Greece has supposedly been invaded by many different people since its golden age. Greece was under Roman influence for more than 1,000 years. In the Middle Ages, it was under Frankish and Florentine rules, and after that, it fell under Ottoman and Turkish rules until the early 19th century. How were Greeks able to preserve a spoken language so close to the original after more than 2,500 years and so many foreign invaders? Now, some of the biggest objections when someone hears about this ancient Greece being basically a phantom of something that happened more recently, up to 1,800 years more recently, is that Homer, Alexander the Great, Ptolemy, if ancient Greece is a phantom, then so are all of these characters. So this can be very concerning. But there are sections in this book devoted to talking about specific phantom events and people. One of the big ones here is Homer, of course, one of the oldest writings that we know of, supposedly. But there's a chapter in this book discussing whether the Homeric period is really the Omeric period. Omer instead of Homer. Because so little is known about Homer, scholars disagree on the time when he lived, and some even question his very existence. The Greek poet is said to have been blind and is thought to have lived sometime before 650 BC, or perhaps as early as 700 to 750 BC. According to Herodotus, Homer didn't live earlier than 4 centuries before him, which means after 840 BC in Scaligean chronology. According to Oliver Taplin, an Oxford University scholar who worked on Greek drama and also on Homer, the Greek poet is largely a fiction of later times, and the historical context for the creation of these epic poems most probably corresponds to the period 750 to 650 BC. So if a poet named Homer did exist, he probably lived between 750 or 650 BC in Scaligean chronology. According to Plato, Homer was known as the first teacher of the tragedians, and indeed the teacher of all Greece. Another aspect which is not well known is whether Homer was literate or not. In other words, did Homer actually write down the poems himself, or did he dictate them to a literate scribe? The second option seems more likely if the poet was indeed blind. Most scholars think that Homer's poems took on a fixed written form 1 or 2 centuries after his death. They believe his poems merely existed in an oral form when Homer was alive, and that the Iliad and the Odyssey took on a fixed and written form as late as the 6th century BC. In any case, both poems are said to have been permanently copied and archived by a special commission. Another peculiar aspect of Homer is the unusual character of his name. This particular name appears to be rather unique in the 3 millennia of Greek history. There seems to be only a few exceptions, and these happen to be found in the 13th century AD. At this time, a whole family bore a name which is quite close to Homer's, the St. Omer clan, who played a key role in medieval Greece between the years 1200 and 1314 AD. The St. Omer clan was a family of Frankish knights who came from what is today northern France. Greece at this time had fallen under Frankish rule, and thus often referred to as Francocratia. Godfrey of St. Omer, for example, was one of the founding members of the famed Knights Templar in the year 1119. An 1800-year chronological shift would redate Homer's life around 1050 AD, just a few decades before the arrival of the St. Omer family in Greece. Homer's poems are supposed to have taken on a fixed written form in the middle of the 6th century BC, which means that perhaps Homer did live at that later time rather than the earlier, merely writing down poems that had remained exclusively oral until then, so he was the one writing down a traditional poem, or traditional story. In this case, the Thanksgiving effect would have created the myth of Homer living earlier than he actually did, and taking the mid-6th century BC and applying an 1800-year chronological shift takes us to the mid-13th century AD, the exact time when the St. Omer clan ruled over Frankish Greece. Is it possible that the real Homer was actually a member of the St. Omer family who had the famous oral epic written down by a scribe at the time? It is also interesting to note that in Homer's poem, the Iliad, Greeks are mostly referred to not as Greeks or Hellenes, but as Achaeans. The name appears to be used no less than 598 times, whereas the other two names used in the poem are used only 29 and 138 times respectively. Why were the Greeks called Achaeans? The reason why it is so is that in ancient times, Achaea supposedly referred to the whole of Greece, which means the Achaeans were Greeks. Later on there was a change. The region called Achaea restricted itself to the northernmost region of the Peloponnese. Under the Romans there was another change. Achaea covered once more the whole of the Peloponnese, as well as part of eastern and northern Greece. It changed again after the fall of Rome, and became once more a small regional unit in the northern Peloponnese. Here we see a smaller example of phantom events. Let's recap this briefly. The term Achaean has successfully designated in Greece, number 1, Greeks living in the Peloponnese and beyond, number 2, Greeks living only in the northernmost part of the Peloponnese, number 3, Greeks and Romans living in the Peloponnese and beyond, number 4, Greeks living only in the northernmost part of the Peloponnese, number 5, Greeks and Franks living in a principality covering most or all of the Peloponnese, number 6, Greeks living only in the northernmost part of the Peloponnese. History, so it looks, appears to have repeated itself not just once, but twice. Numbers 1 and 2 are identical to numbers 3 and 4, and are also identical to number 5 and 6. Is history really repeating itself, or are the first couples of numbers on the list phantom duplicates of couple 5 and 6, which occurred last? According to mainstream historians, the Greek Dark Ages are a period lasting more than 4 centuries during which the Mycenaean palaces and cities were suddenly abandoned or destroyed. The problem is that the archaeological record does not provide any convincing explanation for such a collapse. Apparently the setting of the Greek Dark Ages between 1200 BC and 750 BC is due to the necessity for Greek historians to conform to Egyptologists who placed the Egyptian 18th dynasty in the 15th to 14th centuries BC, as there is no doubt that the high point of the ancient Greek culture is contemporaneous to the Egyptian 18th dynasty, as these artifacts are found together in many archaeological digs. But what if dating the Egyptian 18th dynasty were plain wrong? Indeed, before Egyptologists placed this dynasty at a particular time depth, the ancient Greek Mycenaean era was thought to be much closer to us. It is then an enticing possibility that these Greek Dark Ages never happened, and that the Mycenaean era immediately preceded the Archaic period. Getting back to Homer, the St. Omer clan owes its name to the town of St. Omer, which is today situated in the northernmost part of France. Is the Odyssey set in northern Europe? The Odyssey is presumed to describe Ulysses' voyage into the Mediterranean Sea, and Troy is supposed to be situated in modern Turkey. While there is no reason to fully reject these statements, we may wonder whether or not the poem includes geographical features of the Atlantic and northern Europe as well. That Ulysses' travels might have taken place in the Atlantic Ocean is by no means a recent theory. Greek geographer Strabo, who allegedly lived in the 1st century BC and early 1st century AD, already voiced such an opinion. Many other authors have contended that Ulysses' sea trip took place mostly in northern Europe. According to Dutch authors, Troy was actually located not far from modern Cambridge in England, and that the Odyssey took place in the Atlantic Ocean. It could be that Homer's Thames, for example, is truly the Thames, virtually the same name phonetically. If the Odyssey truly describes the Mediterranean, how is it possible that Homer described what really looked like the midnight sun, which can be observed only north of the Arctic Circle? There are many other incongruities which point to the idea that maybe the Phaeacians in the Odyssey were the Vikings who brought these stories with them in the Mediterranean as recently as a millennium ago. Hailing from Scandinavia, Vikings are known to have invaded parts of the Mediterranean in the 9th and 10th centuries AD, and the Normans, Northmen, who settled in Normandy, today in northern France, were none other than the descendants of the Vikings, who invaded Italy, Sicily, and even Greece in the 11th and 12th centuries AD. More particularly, Normans are known to have partially destroyed Thebes and Corinth in 1146. If we subtract 1800 years to these last two dates, we end up with a Scaligerian time frame of 719 to 651 BC, i.e. the 8th to 7th centuries BC, which nearly corresponds to the time when Homeric poems are said to have emerged in their oral form. Here's what might have happened. Vikings or Normans, people of Viking ancestry, brought their northern folktales with them in the Mediterranean. At the time, they must have remained oral epic poems. This may have occurred between the 9th and 12th century AD. Later on, in the 12th or 13th centuries, members of the St. Omer clan who had settled in Greece became familiar with these Viking stories circulating in the Mediterranean at the time and wrote down or dictated the poems which are viewed today as seminal masterpieces of Western literature. Considering that the St. Omer clan came from northern France, in a region which is immediately adjacent to Normandy, the place settled by the Normans in the previous centuries, it might even be argued that these tales had been heard there rather than in the Mediterranean. Some confusion arose later as to who had written the poems and when, but the name Omer was remembered as Homeros in Greece, and the fact that he was a blind man was also recalled. The fact that both the Greek Homer and the French bishop Saint Omer are said to have been blind men might indicate that they are one and the same person, perhaps two much distorted versions of a man who was a poet, and who knows, a bishop or perhaps a warrior when he was younger, who lived in Frankish Greece in the 13th century AD. If true, the Rashomon effect, the language factor, and the Thanksgiving effect have probably played major roles in the process of distortion. It was only the creation of Scaligerian chronology in the 16th and 17th centuries which pushed the Homer of Greek history and the Saint Omer of French history back in time, each in a distinct period. It is telling that Homer's poems are supposed to have been lost, or at least almost totally forgotten, for more than a millennium in the Western world, roughly between the time of the Roman Empire and the Italian Renaissance. In the 14th century, Homer's poems were translated into Latin, and people were critical of the translation at the time, but at least it allowed Western Europe to have access to Homer's works. It could be an accident that the Odyssey and the Iliad have many Viking aspects to them, which recall the Arctic Circle in Northern Europe, and it could be an accident that Homer's poems in their oral form are supposed to have been created 1800 years rather than, say, 650 or 1575 or 2200 years before the time of the Viking and Norman invasions. And it could have been an accident that Homer's poems in their written form are supposed to have emerged 1800 years rather than, say, 225 years or 950 years before the time of the St. Omer clan who ruled parts of Greece. It could be an accident that Homer is supposed to have lived at a time when Greece was called Achaea, while the St. Omer family lived at a time when much of Greece was called the Principality of Achaea. And it could be an accident that both Homer and St. Omer were blind, and that Homer's poems were translated into Latin shortly after the time the St. Omer clan ruled Greece. It's a total of 6 accidents, but who knows? On the contrary, if we accept that much of the history of ancient Greece is affected by an 1800-year chronological shift, then everything becomes logical and straightforward. The sequence of events leading to the creation of the famous poems occurred between the 9th and 14th centuries AD. When only one parameter is changed, the date of the events, the bizarre series of accidents instantly disappears. There are many examples of history repeating itself, and Greek history appears to be somewhat redundant in its conventional Scaligerian version, with repetitive patterns appearing here and there, such as Homer and the St. Omer clan, the Achaeans of Homer, and the Principality of Achaea. But these repetitive patterns are not confined to these 2 examples. The names that Greeks have used during their history to designate themselves appear to be cyclical too. Greeks have almost never referred to themselves as Greeks. The word derives from a Latin word, but it has almost never been used by the Greeks to designate themselves. So, although it is used in many modern languages today, just as it was used by the Romans at the time of the Roman Empire, Greeks have mainly used two other terms to refer to themselves in their own language: the Hellenes and the Romans. The Greeks appear to have begun to use the term Hellenes to designate themselves as a people during the 8th century BC with the first Olympic Games. Before that, the word Hellene seems to have been only a regional name. When Romans conquered Greece in the 1st century BC, the Greeks apparently happily accepted to be called Romans, just like other Roman citizens living in the Italian peninsula, a name which stuck for many centuries. At the same time, with the rise of Christianity, the term Hellenes became associated with paganism and thus fell into disuse. Something quite strange occurred at the turn of the first millennium AD. We are told that in the 9th century AD there was a sudden revival of the term Hellenes, and that by the 11th century AD the word meant once more what it had meant in ancient times. This lapsed for a few centuries, and then late in Byzantine times, there was an apparent revival of the term Romans, even after the fall of Constantinople in the mid-15th century. It was only as late as the early 19th century, when Greece struggled to recover its independence from the Turks, that the Greeks decided to reuse the term Hellenes to refer to themselves. This is a second revival of the name Hellenes. So to recap, according to the conventional history, the Greeks have called themselves the Hellenes, the Romans, the Hellenes, the Romans, and the Hellenes again. We can immediately perceive that steps 1 and 2 are identical to steps 3 and 4, with step 5 starting the process one more time. Is it just one of those strange accidents of history, or are these repetitive patterns a clue that the first 2 steps of the list are the phantom duplicates of steps 3 and 4? In other words, it looks like steps 1 and 2 are phantom history, and that steps 3 or 4 are the original blueprint. The most interesting aspect is that the 11th century AD, the moment when the word Hellenes is supposed to have recovered its meaning of ancient times, happens to be chronologically located exactly 1800 years after the 8th century BC, the moment when the term Hellenes was first applied to designate all Greeks in the Scaligerine timeline. These lists suggest a very different story from the conventional timeline of Greece. What is likely to have truly happened is the following. The Greeks have first used the term Hellenes around the 9th century AD, and this term became fully established by the 11th century AD. Incredible though it may seem, the Roman Empire must be much closer to us than we think, perhaps as late as the 11th to 13th centuries AD. At some juncture during this period, the Hellenes started to refer to themselves as Romans, a name that stuck until the early 19th century. After that, the term Hellenes truly became fashionable again when Greece regained its independence from Ottoman rule. Evidence suggests that all Greek history between the 8th century BC and the 9th century AD is merely an extended phantom projection of what happened after the 9th century AD. It is also quite telling to note that the very name of the city of Athens was, in Homer's time, Athene, or Athene, a singular name. It then turned into Athenia in a later period, which is the plural form of Athene. During the Middle Ages, we are told that the singular name Athene became popular again. Doesn't this process remind you of something? We are also told that the plural form of Athenia, because of the conservatism of the written language, remained the official name of the city until the 1970s. After that, in recent years, it was decided to switch back once again to the singular form, which in modern Greek is Athena. In a nutshell, the history of the name of the capital city of Greece more or less shows the following pattern, which mirrors what has been said about the names of the Greeks themselves in the previous section. First they called themselves Athene, singular, then Athenia, plural, then Athene, singular, and Athenia, plural, and then finally Athenia, singular. Once more, it looks very much like the first occurrences 1 and 2 are the phantom duplicates of the dual occurrence 3, which might have arisen in 2 steps. Occurrence 4 shows once again a recent wish for contemporary Greeks to return to the original name, which is probably much more recent than what Scaligerine chronology suggests, namely the period we now call the Middle Ages. One fundamental aspect in the development of Greece is the rise of cities. The period of urbanization appeared in a time that mainstream historians widely refer to as the birth of Greece, the period 800 BC to 600 BC. Many centuries after the golden age of Greece, these cities started to decline in importance and the country seems to have become a land of villages again. Oddly enough, much later, in the 11th to 12th centuries AD, Greece started to urbanize once more. This, of course, would only be half interesting if, once again, the time interval between these two periods weren't exactly 1800 years. Again, it looks like the first period of Greek urbanization never existed. It is merely the phantom duplicate of events that transpired as late as the 11th century AD at the earliest. And there is a similar story with the famous rise of Athenian democracy, about 2,500 years ago. But Athenian democracy might actually be of much more recent origin. Athenian democracy is generally traced back to Solon, who in 594 BC was chosen by Athenians to revise the laws. There was a need for a new constitution that would be more equitable for the citizens. There were further Athenian politicians and reformers over the next couple hundred years, and Athenians apparently governed themselves during this time. The end of Athenian democracy coincides with the rise of Macedonian power, led by Philip II and his famous son Alexander the Great. More precisely, it is usually considered that Athenian democracy met its fatal end 1 year after Alexander's death in 323 BC, when a Macedonian general took Athens. And if this chronology is true, Athenian democratic self-rule thrived for less than 2 centuries, and then stopped for more than 2,000 years, only to come back in fairly recent times in the 17th century. But we can envision an alternative hypothesis. We can begin with the tantalizing possibility that the seminal idea of democracy was brought by the Vikings, just as Homer's poem, the Odyssey, is in all likelihood a Viking tale, or at the very least a Mediterranean tale with strong Viking and Norman influences. As we have seen, the first recorded name of Athens is Athene. It is the name Homer used in his poems. It is known that the Vikings held general assemblies, which are usually seen as an independent proto-form of democracy in Northern Europe, where powerful leaders, later extended to free men, would meet together to dispense justice. In Old English and Old Norse, these general assemblies were known as ping, pronounced like thing. And in Iceland and the Faroe Islands, they were called alting or altingi. They are known to have existed since the Middle Ages. One such thing is to be found on the Isle of Man, a self-governing crown dependency in the Irish Sea. It still exists to this day under the name of Tynwald, or in its full name, the Higher Court of Tynwald. It literally means the Thing Field, and it is claimed to have existed since the year 979 AD, making it the oldest continuous parliamentary body in the world. The Althing, the Parliament of Iceland, was founded even earlier in 930 AD. The names Athene and Althingi are strikingly similar, with the same th sound, which is pronounced the same way. If our idea that ancient Greece is much more recent than conventional historians think it is, then it is perfectly possible for the name of the city to be of Viking origin, even if the original town was probably founded by an earlier people, most probably the Mycenaeans. The sounds I and G may have subsequently disappeared through phonetic erosion. Is the Acropolis of Athens and Althingi just like those founded by the Vikings in Northern Europe from Scandinavia to Iceland? In Iceland, important public matters were discussed on the Law Rock, the rocky outcrop of the Acropolis of Athens, and the similar Areopagus rock in front of it may have looked like perfect sites for Viking-style Athingi, and it is indeed there that Athenian democracy thrived between the alleged 6th and 4th centuries BC. We have seen that Vikings may have visited Athens in the 9th and 10th centuries AD, and the Normans in the 11th and 12th centuries AD. Applying the 1800-year chronological shift, the time frame 6th to 4th centuries BC of Athenian democracy corresponds to the 13th and 14th centuries AD, immediately after the time of the Normans. What if Vikings or Normans did make the Acropolis of Athens and Althingi? Interestingly, according to historians, Athens was so small and unimportant at that time that when the Normans fell upon Greece in 1146, they spared Athens. Quote, the Athenians perhaps owed their immunity on that occasion to their insignificance, end quote. If our theory is correct, this tradition of assemblies might have given Athens its name in the first place, later inspiring Solon and helping Athenian democracy establish itself there in the following centuries, in the 13th and 14th centuries AD, at the time of Franco-Cratia, when Greece was in Frankish rule. Solon's date of 594 BC revising Athenian laws, plus 1800 years gets us to the year 1207 AD. This is indeed a very interesting date, as the early 1200s corresponds to the arrival of Franks in Greece. And at this time it is interesting that the first Frankish lord of Athens, Othon, appears to be quite similar to Paistratos, the first of the 3 tyrants of Athens who lived about 18 centuries before Othon. These 2 characters could likely have been the same person, the tyrannical great leader. By another odd coincidence, the English Magna Carta emerged in England in 1215 AD. The Great Charter of the Liberties. This founding document can arguably be defined as the first European Charter of Human Rights. Designed by Anglo-Norman barons to curb the monarch's power, it is the first such document in British history. What the 1215 Great Charter shows is that in this period, English people started to be concerned with human rights. Was this form of progress in some way inspired from Athenian proto-democracy instituted by Solon, perhaps witnessed by crusaders roaming the Mediterranean? Or was it the other way around? Did the Magna Carta influence Franks, who in turn influenced Greeks? It is of course difficult to say, but the fact that our 1800-year shift makes the beginnings of Athenian democracy and the Magna Carta virtually simultaneous in our proposed revised timeline is quite intriguing, especially when you realize that Franks came from northwestern Europe. It is also interesting to note that the Magna Carta was written in Latin, not in any form of English. Could that mean that at that time, in 1215 AD, England was still part of the Roman Empire, Latin being the official language of the Roman Empire? Interestingly, this is exactly what Anatoly Fomenko contends. The Roman Empire should be moved forward about 1100 years. What's more, as we have seen, at the time the Byzantine Empire was precisely called the Roman Empire. If the hypothesis of this book is correct, Athenian democracy must have truly occurred approximately 1800 years later than said in Scaligerine chronology, approximately between 1293 and 1479 AD. There is an important date, 1458, which corresponds to the beginning of the Ottoman period in Athens. This date has to be compared to our estimated date for the true end of Greek democracy, i.e. 1479 AD. Athenian democracy is supposed to have reached its end in 322 BC when Macedonian general Antipater invaded Athens. 18 years after the beginning of Philip II's campaign against Byzantium, and only 12 years after his son Alexander the Great crossed the Hellespont. Is it possible that these conquerors, today remembered as Macedonians living in the 4th century BC, were truly Turks living in the 15th century AD? Is it possible that Athenian democracy truly flourished in the 13th to 15th centuries AD, and that it disappeared shortly after the fall of Athens by the Turks? According to textbook history, Athens fell to the Macedonians in 322 BC, and Athens fell to the Ottomans in 1458 AD. That's a 1779-year time interval. Once again, we are struck by the similarity of the patterns occurring at two very different historical times which are close to being 1800-year distant in Scaligerine chronology. First, we have in antiquity a very strong Greek state followed by a siege on Byzantium, soon followed by the fall of Athens. And then we have in the Middle Ages a very strong Greek state followed by a siege on Constantinople, soon followed by the fall of Athens. And of course, Byzantium is the former name of Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. The first strong Greek state is usually referred to as Classical Greece, or the Hellenic period, and it is usually set between 510 BC and 322 BC. But if we consider it to begin with Solon changing Athenian law, which was the first stage of Athenian democracy in 594 BC, we can extend the period from 594 to 322 BC, a period of 272 years. The second strong Greek state is Frankish Greece. The Duchy of Athens began in 1204 AD and ended when it fell to the Ottomans in 1458. This is a 254-year period. We see that the two periods are comparable in terms of duration, 272 years for the first, 254 years for the second. And there is a case to be made that Antipater and Omer Bey, who took Athens successively in the Classical period and in the Frankish period, could very well be the same person. And Byzantium itself could very well be a Frankish name. Switching gears to the Parthenon, there is a lot that could be said about this famous site, but I will mention just a couple interesting points. The Parthenon is said to be built using the Fibonacci sequence, but after the period of Classical Greece, the Western world seems to have forgotten about both pi and the Fibonacci sequence until Fibonacci was told about it by the Indians in 1202 AD, despite the Parthenon supposedly having remained intact for so many centuries. And of course, Fibonacci rediscovered pi just 2 years before the Franks arrived in Athens. Nobody seems to have talked about the Parthenon for about 175 years of Frankish presence, and we don't have any artwork of the Parthenon until the 17th century. And of course, there was another roughly 1800-year gap between the main constructions on top of the Acropolis and when they reappear later in history. Now let's talk about Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. To this day, Plato remains one of the most celebrated philosophers in history and one of the most influential thinkers of all time. Plato's student, Aristotle, whose ideas were at odds with those of his teacher, is no less illustrious. And just like Plato's own teacher, Socrates, each of these characters remain major figures in Western philosophy. Plato and Aristotle are supposed to have lived in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Aristotle is said to have died in the exact year that Athens fell to the Macedonians, marking the end of Athenian democracy. Is it possible that both Plato and Aristotle lived as late as the 14th and 15th century AD? A man named Georgius Pletho is remembered in Byzantine history as one of the most original thinkers of his time, and one of the greatest philosophers of the 15th century. Pletho was Greek, and is said to have been a Neoplatonic philosopher, as he was a great admirer of Plato and had developed very similar philosophical ideas. He is also credited as being one of the chief pioneers of the revival of Greek learning in Rome and other Western capitals during the Renaissance, supposedly lost for centuries. The similarities between Plato and Pletho are numerous. They have similar names, Plato and Pletho. They speak the same language, Greek. They have the same field of activity, philosophy. They have a similar notoriety, Plato being known as the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece, and Pletho being known as the greatest philosopher of his time. They had comparable life length. Plato is said to live around 75 to 80 years, and Pletho 92 to 100 years. They had a similar influential teacher. Plato had Socrates, and Pletho had Lysias. They had similar ideas. Plato created Platonism, the notion that the material world is just an imperfect copy of the ideal world of forms, and Pletho defended Platonism. He was a Neoplatonist. They had similar writings. Plato wrote the Republic and the Laws. Pletho wrote a book called the Treaty of Laws, based on Plato's The Laws and the Republic. They had similar religious beliefs. Plato was polytheistic. Pletho advocated the return of Greek polytheism. And they were both similar in making Plato, whoever Plato was, famous. Plato supposedly became very famous in his lifetime, but Pletho made Plato very famous by influencing Italian humanists to translate Plato into Latin. They had a comparable achievement. Plato founded the Academy in Athens. Pletho influenced Cosimo de' Medici in founding a new Platonic academy in Florence. And finally, they had a similar student. Plato had Aristotle, who opposed Plato and invented Aristotelianism, emphasizing knowledge from the senses, and Pletho's student Scalaris, who opposed Pletho and was a defender of Aristotelianism. In spite of many differences in the details, the parallelism is striking, each philosopher's life basically following the same general blueprint. In addition to that, Plato is said to have lived almost exactly 1800 years before Pletho. What the list above and this time gap strongly suggest, once again, is that either Plato is the phantom duplicate of Pletho, or Plato is a fictitious character created by Pletho. We'll explore these two possibilities further, but first, is Socrates the phantom duplicate of Lysias? Socrates is supposed to have been Plato's teacher, greatly influencing him in his philosophical ideas. Socrates is quite an enigmatic figure who left no writing. He is only known through the accounts of Plato, students, and classical writers. Socrates had to face trial for several reasons, among which impiety and atheism, and also for creating new divinities. The traditional verdict of the trial is well known. He was sentenced to death by drinking poison hemlock. Jumping 1800 years forward, Lysias was Pletho's teacher, greatly influencing his life and philosophical ideas. He was a Jewish professor in Adrianopolis, today part of the European portion of Turkey. At the time though, Adrianopolis was the capital city of the Ottoman Sultanate. In 1390, Lysias was executed by the Turks, who burned him on the stake, because his religious ideas went against those promoted by the Turks. Although different in the details, Socrates' and Lysias' lives have two very similar blueprints, as one can plainly see. According to the conventional history, the two men died 1789 years apart from one another. Is Aristotle the phantom duplicate of Scalaris? Just like Plato had a student, Aristotle, who opposed his master's ideas and became a celebrated philosopher too, Pletho had a student, Scalaris, who also had antagonistic ideas and became a respected philosopher in his time. He was a staunch defender of Aristotle's ideas. He wrote a book emphasizing the importance of empiricism, which later gave birth to the scientific method, opposing Platonic ideas. Unfortunately, the book is now lost. A critic might immediately observe that the two names Aristotle and Scalaris are different, but is that really so? Scalaris' first name, Gennadius, comes from the Greek Gennadus, which means noble or generous, while the name Scalaris comes either from the Latin scala or the Greek scholio, which relates to the English school and student and means scholar. So the name taken as a whole can be translated as the noble student, probably Pletho's noble student. The name Aristotle comes from the Greek Aristos, meaning the noblest, the best, or excellent. to which is added the suffix telos, which means aim or purpose. So the whole name means something like the noblest purpose. We see that the names are actually quite close to each other and look like nicknames, both probably paying tribute to the exceptional intellectual qualities of the two students, who are supposed to have lived in two very different times and who are said to have been taught by two distinct teachers. But is that really so? We can sum up the common points between Aristotle and Scholaris in the following list. Number 1, part of Aristotle's name means noble in Greek. Part of Scholaris' name means noble in Greek. Number 2, they have a similar role in early life. Aristotle was Plato's student. Scholaris was Pletho's student. Indeed, Scholaris means student. Number 3, they have the same field of activity, philosophy. Number 4, they have a similar attitude towards their master. They both opposed their master. Number 5, they had similar philosophical ideas. Aristotle created Aristotelianism, which focused on empiricism, and Scholaris was a strong advocate of the Aristotelian philosophy. Number 6, they had a similar political context. Aristotle lived during the siege of Byzantium, the future Constantinople, and Scholaris lived during the fall of Constantinople. And number 7, they had a comparable function. Aristotle was asked by Philip II of Macedon, who besieged Byzantium, to become the tutor to his son Alexander the Great. And Scholaris was named Patriarch of Constantinople by Mehmet II, who took Constantinople, or Byzantium. So they both essentially worked for the conqueror of Byzantium. The time interval between Aristotle's death and Scholaris' death is 1794 years, a gap which is once more very close to 1800 years. We are left with the impression that Aristotle is the phantom duplicate of Scholaris. Plato's Socratic dialogue in The Republic is the philosopher's most famous and influential work. It is generally considered as Plato's masterpiece, and is supposed to have been written around 380 BC. The book deals with the notions of justice in the city-state. Pletho, approximately 1800 years later, according to the currently accepted chronology, wrote a series of books about political, legal, economic, religious, social, and moral reforms, usually referred to as the Treaty of Laws. According to the textbook history, of course, these books are based on Plato's works. At the time, Pletho was in exile in Maestras, because his support for Plato was considered heretic for the Turks of Adrianople, where he had been living since he was a student. Unfortunately, nearly all of the pages of Pletho's books were deliberately burnt by Scholaris because of their anti-Christian contents, so almost nothing of Pletho's work survives today. Plato and Pletho might have been the same person, and that 1800-year gap between them might be non-existent. And parts of the philosopher's life may have ended up in two different biographies, which were written by different people, the Rashomon effect and other similar event-distorting factors blurring the picture. A second tantalizing possibility is that Plato is a fictional character created by Pletho, but in that case, why would he have done that? Well, the two hypotheses here are one, that Pletho was Plato, and that later generations came to believe Pletho and Plato were two different philosophers. And the second hypothesis is that Plato was Pletho's pseudo. Writing under a pseudonym is common practice for writers in general, and it might have been a way for Pletho to put forward his philosophical ideas without being persecuted for them. Remember that both Plato and Pletho's teachers had been executed for their ideas. And already we know that Pletho was in exile because of his ideas. So he had incentive to create a pseudonym to avoid the death sentence like his teacher. In this case, Socrates, who is only known through Plato and a few other classical authors, was probably another fictional character created by Pletho, meant to pay tribute to his late teacher, Lysias. Pletho may have been helped in his forgery by fellow writers at this time, people who are now wrongly considered ancient. So who was Aristotle? Using the same reasoning as in Hypothesis 1, it might be that some of Scholaris' writings were attributed to Aristotle. Using a similar reasoning as in Hypothesis 2, it might be that Pletho or a fellow writer allegorically decided to refer to Scholaris' ideas by using the fictional name Aristotle, a supposedly ancient writer living at the same time as Plato, in order to stay out of trouble. Although this hypothesis may sound incredible, it becomes quite logical once the 1800-year gap is suppressed, and it is supported by more evidence. One man who played a key role in what has come to be known as the revival of ancient Greek and the diffusion of Plato and Aristotle's writings is the humanist Leonardo Bruni, who lived in the 14th and 15th centuries. He also translated Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon, another classic author, into Latin. Interestingly, this happened during Pletho's and Scholaris' lifetimes. It was at this time that the Florentines discovered superb classical Greek and Roman manuscripts that had presumably been lost, or rather forgotten about. Were these books really classics, or were they rather recent works written in the last decades by people who were still alive, such as Pletho? At this time, Pletho was around 80 years old and had potentially had plenty of time to write Plato's books. It is indeed very strange and suspicious that prestigious books such as Plato's, supposedly written in deep antiquity, had never been translated into Latin, and just as strange that it was suddenly happening then, precisely 1800 years after their authors had supposedly lived. Strangest of all is the fact that Plato's books were translated precisely when Pletho was alive, an amusing synchronicity. Why weren't Plato's books translated during the golden age of the Roman Empire, say, between the years 1 and 250 AD, for instance? Last but not least, the first translator of Plato's extant works into Latin was in the new Platonic Academy created in Florence a few years after Pletho's death. So yes, Plato's works were translated in the academy started by Pletho. And similar synchronicities can be observed with regards to the translation of Aristotle's work into Latin. Is it possible that the famous academy founded by Plato was actually founded by Pletho 1800 years later, which would mean around 1414 AD? Finally, let's go and talk about the Hellenistic period and the Renaissance. As we have already seen, the period of 340 to 320 BC is a pivotal moment in ancient Greek history. The arrival of the Macedonians, first in Byzantium, then in Athens, changed the face of the region and triggered the beginning of the so-called Hellenistic period, during which many Greeks emigrated throughout the Mediterranean area, spreading Greek language and culture throughout the Mediterranean basin and also many parts of Asia. As we are going to see, these key events find their counterpart 1800 years later with the arrival of the Ottoman Turks and the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the ensuing Renaissance period, when many Greek scholars were forced into emigration and ancient Greek texts were suddenly rediscovered in Western Europe, mainly in Italy. Let's talk about Philip II of Macedon. He tried to take Byzantium in 340 BC, but he had to retreat the following year. The English name Philip comes from the Greek Philippos, which means fond of horses, and thus may not be the real name of the Macedonian Philip II in his original language. Was it because he was remembered as a distinguished horseman that he was later nicknamed Fond of Horses by Greek chroniclers? It was his son, the famed Alexander the Great, who made Byzantium Macedonian a few years later, although nothing seems to be known about Alexander actually conquering Byzantium. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont and started to conquer many territories in Asia, most notably the Persian Empire and India and Northeast Africa. These conquests are generally regarded as the onset of the Hellenistic period, the spreading of Greek culture in many parts of the ancient world. Many scholars use the year of Alexander's demise in 323 BC as the true beginning of the Hellenistic period. Alexander was only 22 years old when he crossed the Hellespont. He died very young, aged 32. As we have already seen, after Alexander's death, General Antipater took Athens in 322 BC. Now compare this with Mehmed II, the conqueror. In 1422 AD, the Ottoman Sultan Murad II besieged Constantinople, but failed to conquer the city, just like Philip II had failed to conquer the city. It was Murad's son, Mehmed II, the conqueror, who finally managed to take Constantinople in 1453, putting an end to the Byzantine Empire, a modern name for what was actually the Eastern Roman Empire, simply named the Roman Empire at the time. The fall of Constantinople accelerated what had already begun, the emigration of many Greeks and many ancient Greek texts that started to be rediscovered in the West, a period which is now referred to as the Renaissance. Mehmed II was only 21 years old at the time. Contrary to Alexander the Great, he lived until the age of 49. Although quite different in the details, the two sequences of events, set nearly 1800 years apart, share many common points and follow a similar blueprint. In both cases, we observe this order: a long period of prosperity for Greece, the failed siege of Byzantium or Constantinople by a foreign conqueror, the fall of Byzantium, Constantinople, by the son of the first conqueror, a period of Greek emigration which makes many parts of the ancient world become Hellenized, and finally the fall of Athens by another general belonging to the same conquering people. In the standard timeline, the failed sieges of Byzantium and Constantinople occurred 1761 years apart, the actual falls of the same city occurring some 1786 years apart, and the falls of Athens occurring 1779 years apart. The similarities do not end here. Murad II was born 1785 years after Philip II, and he died 1786 years after him. They were both 46 years old when they died. Please note that both men are the second bearers of their respective names in their respective dynasties, Philip II and Murad II. Now, Alexander died much younger than Mehmed II, but the question of the real identity and true time of Alexander the Great is very tricky, as Alexander is briefly mentioned in a handful of ancient texts, such as, for instance, the Bible and the Quran. In addition, he is mentioned in Persian literature, in Dante's Divine Comedy, and more. But there is suspicion that most, if not all, of these works are misdated, and that Alexander lived around the same time as Mehmet II. Let us now introduce another historical figure, Skanderberg, who might shed a new light on the problem. George Castriot, or Skanderberg, is now a national hero in Albania. He died 1791 years after Alexander the Great. Skanderberg happens to be strangely similar to Alexander. Both were exceptional military commanders, both hail from the same part of the world, and both became outstanding legendary figures. Skanderberg is one of the main constitutive myths of Albanian nationalism, and many legends have grown around him since he gallantly defended his territories against the Ottoman enemy in the 15th century. In addition, Skanderberg's very name directly derives from Alexander. According to conventional history, the name Iksender, leader Alexander, was given to him by the Ottoman Turks. The name is rendered as Skanderberg in Albanian and Skanderberg in English. Why such a moniker? Because George Castriot's military skills, we are being told, compare to those of Alexander the Great. But where does the name Alexander itself come from? Interestingly, the Greek Alexandros means defending man. Once more, it is amusing to see that both Alexander and Skanderberg were exceptional defending men. Although it might be argued that the first one was more a conqueror than a defending man, it is unquestionable that the second valiantly and heroically defended his territories and people. Indeed, Skanderberg is remembered as the most persistent opponent of the Ottoman Empire. It is then tempting to see in Alexander the Great a mere nickname given to the military hero after his exploits. Is this great defending man literally Alexander the Great, the nickname attributed by the Greeks to the 15th century man the Turks later called Iksender, or Leader Alexander, which is virtually the same thing, today of course being remembered as the national hero Skanderberg in Albania? If this is true, then Skanderberg remained in his rightful time slot, whereas Alexander was sent back 1800 years back into the past with the rest of Greek history. This contention finds strong support in the fact that Skanderberg is known to have worn a two-horned helmet. This detail is of particular interest to us, as Alexander the Great appears in the Quran with a name which literally means the two-horned one. As always, on the surface, Alexander the Great and Skanderberg appear to be quite different people. Alexander conquered Persia and then territories stretching east to the Indus River, whereas Skanderberg, who had begun as serving the Ottoman Empire before deserting the Ottoman army in 1444, led a rebellion against the Turks in what is today Albania and Macedonia, which is obviously a more restricted territory than Alexander. Interestingly though, on the west side, both the territories conquered or defended by Alexander and Skanderberg parallel each other, both extending to the Adriatic Sea. What if the Albanians knew only part of the story? What if they had forgotten about the territories conquered east of the Bosphorus, because they are too remote from them? An alternative solution to the problem is that the character of Alexander the Great is a combination of the biographies of Skanderberg and Mehmet II. In any case, what is truly fascinating about Skanderberg are the numerous myths that have grown around the military commander in the centuries following his death, a situation which reminds us of the myths surrounding the first Thanksgiving. As Alexander the Great allegedly lived 1800 years earlier, one can only imagine how many more myths might have been born during such a huge period, and then wonder how many real facts about him, if any, have survived until today. Can the Turks have been called Macedonians? It is somewhat easy to understand why Greeks might have called the Turks Macedonians, since they both came from the north. Now, I know this video's gone kind of long, but we're beginning to wrap this up, and let us compare, in a little bit more detail, the Hellenistic period and the Renaissance, to see if they might actually refer to one and the same period. A quick definition of the Hellenistic period is a period in history defined as the time between the death of Alexander the Great and the rise of Roman domination. During this time, Greek culture was dominant throughout the Mediterranean. It was also an age characterized by many advances in philosophy, science, literature, and art. In a nutshell, the Hellenistic period is the spread of Greek, Hellenic culture and the mixture of Greeks with other populations beginning in the late 4th century BC. Just like the name Hellenistic period is a 19th century creation, the Renaissance was coined as late as the 1830s. The Oxford Dictionary defines the Renaissance as the revival of European art and literature under the influence of classical models in the 14th and 16th centuries. But Merriam-Webster defines this slightly differently, writing that the Renaissance is the period of European history between the 14th and 17th centuries when there was a new interest in science and in ancient art and literature, especially in Italy. The opinion of many scholars is that the Renaissance began with the Italian humanists rediscovering ancient authors and writing in Latin and Greek. As we have already seen, Greek authors started to be translated into Latin very late, at the turn of the 15th century. Was the Renaissance the rediscovery and translation of extremely ancient Latin and Greek books which had been forgotten for many centuries, or rather the discovery of recent Latin works and the translation into Latin of very recent Greek works? The data suggest that Greek culture, its philosophy, science, and literature did not spread twice around the Mediterranean, but only once, either right after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, or possibly in the decades or centuries preceding it, i.e. during the Golden Age of Greece. This would imply that the Hellenistic period and the Renaissance are actually more or less one and the same thing. This would imply that Alexandria in Egypt was founded much later than historians think, either right after Mehmed II took Constantinople, or a few decades or perhaps a few centuries before the event. If it was indeed Alexander who gave his name to the city, then it must have happened as late as the 15th century, i.e. in Skanderberg's time. Greek works were translated into Latin at this time only because they were either recent or contemporary books, and there were not two but are only one wave of immigrants who spread Greek culture in the Mediterranean basin in the past. If true, it was not a revival of ancient Greek authors, but rather the continuation of the true Golden Age of Greece, which had occurred not in the 5th century BC, but rather in the 14th century AD. Now, of course, there are some very interesting thoughts that arrive once we realize that Alexander's successors, essentially became dynasties in Egypt, and so the chronology being off in Greece really does affect the chronology of much of the ancient world as well. And though this book limited itself to focusing on Greece, and I think that was a good idea, there is a huge amount of things we could discuss beyond Greece being affected by this timeline shift. Now, I'm not going to get into that in this video, and I will also mention that this author really did avoid the fact that this also affects the timeline of the Bible and the Quran. The New Testament was written in Greek, and we do suppose an 1800-year shift for that language and for that time period. But although there was much more detail in the book and there is many more things that are brought up, I'm going to end the video here and once again recommend buying and reading this book yourself. And for now, that is all I have for today. I appreciate all of you. Until next time. And make sure to check out my channel for many other videos on a whole array of subjects, and my other channels are all in the description of this video. I'm very excited to announce my newest book, Everything the Government Does is Bad for Us. And you can get the paperback on Amazon for just $9.99, and you can find the video read-along version or the audiobook on my website, notusbooks.org. And definitely check out my book, Fake Diseases. It covers all of the major topics that come up, like birth defects, blood sugar problems, bone and joint problems, cancer, autoimmune problems, and more. And it's on Amazon for just $9.99. And the audiobook read-along version is free here on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description of this video. And all of my books, audiobooks, and links are available on my website, notusbooks.org. And if you want to see what is apparently my most controversial video that was banned from YouTube and BitChute, you can go to wagthedogtheory.com and view the whole uncensored version of the video. And I recommend downloading it if it is still there.